Hi, students. Welcome to video 19 on nutrition and food. So some statistics, these are not anything that you need to write down, but just kind of for your information. Almost a billion, you have 925 million people that do not have enough to eat. They don't get enough food every day. And 98% of the world's hungry live in the developing world. And nearly 2/3 of the world's hungry live in Asia and Pacific regions, which we'll see a map in a minute. So women make up about 50% of the world's population, 51 or 52, and you would expect to see that they were the equivalent in that for hunger, but they're not. They're about 60%, 60 to 65% of the world's hungry, and some of that has to do with poverty, and women are also more likely to be living in poverty. So again, not anything you need to write down, but just for your information. And for your information, 1 in 7 people do not get enough food. This does include people in the United States. So we will be talking about that as well, how it does affect people in developed countries. So what we're talking about is food security, and that is basically the guarantee that you're going to have food throughout the day when you actually need it, an adequate amount of nutrients. We are feeding more people today than we did in 1970. Unfortunately, there's still, like you said, almost that 1 billion people that go hungry. But in terms of proportion, there's less now that are hungry than there were in the past. And this graph shows you basically the production of food per person. And so we have been increasing our food production a lot in the past 50 years. So a few definitions that we need to know what we're talking about here. We have both problems. We have undernourishment, which is when you have less than 90% of your calorie needs that are being met. Most of these people are in the developing countries, but there are still some Americans that are undernourished. And then you have overnutrition, which is when you have too many calories that you are eating. So in the United States, about 1/4 of adults are obese, and in the world, there's about 300 million people. So basically, the population of the United States, that's how many people worldwide are obese now, and it's increasing at dramatic rates. And then you have malnutrition, which is having a shortage of vitamins and minerals. So you can be or you can experience overnutrition, having too many calories, but you can also be malnourished, having not enough vitamins and minerals. And that's what's happening in a lot of developed countries around the world. So when we talk about the Green Revolution, this is basically how did we start feeding people around the world. Now, the Green Revolution doesn't mean, eco-friendly, not that sort of green. What we're talking about was basically an increase in food production. So we started using things like fertilizers, irrigation, pesticides, a whole lot more. And we basically were able to almost double, and in some cases even more, the amount of food that we were producing. So the first Green Revolution happened in about the 1950s. There was an increase in production using high input agriculture. So lots of fertilizers, lots of pesticides. Then in the 60s, we started using rice, wheat, and corn, and we basically started growing only those things in the area, which is called a monocrop. And so we basically got tons of rice, tons of wheat, tons of corn, and those are the main things that feed the world today. So the difference between a macronutrient and a micronutrient, you need both of these to be nourished. Macronutrients, are the large things. So carbs, proteins, fats, and then you also need your micronutrients, which are vitamins and minerals. And you don't necessarily need to have all of these things, but you do need to know minerals versus vitamins. So those are your micronutrients, and then macro, the big ones, carbs, proteins, and fats. So where do we get our food from? Well, 77% of our food is grown on croplands, kind of like this one over here, and that only takes up about 11% of the world's land. But then you have these rangelands, pastures, and feedlots where we grow and feed animals, and that's only 16% of our food, but it takes up almost 30% of the world's land. So this is a huge, huge input that we're using to get not a whole lot out. And then we have aquaculture, that's about 7% of our food. Most of the time, if you go to the grocery store and you buy shrimp or fish, unless it says otherwise, it's probably going to be grown from aquaculture. Most of it is not fresh caught anymore. So we see that it disproportionately affects the poor, hunger, which is what we're talking about. So poverty is your root cause of hunger. You have the world's poorest are spending the most amount of money on their food, and then the richest are spending not very much of their income in terms of the proportion of their income. So here's where our underweight children are. We see that most of them are in Asia and the Pacific. So this over here is India. You have a lot of children that are still underweight in Africa regions, but then you have this really skinny line over here in South America and North America. So we do not have very many underweight children in our country, but they do definitely in India. So some terms you need to know: kwashiorkor, that is when you have a low protein amount. So these are the children that have like the distended bellies that you see on TV a lot with sad music. It is a very sad situation. The children that are very, very skinny, you can see their bones. They are usually suffering from marasmus, which is just not having enough, not having enough calories. And then rickets is a vitamin D deficiency. And this is the children that have kind of like these bowed legs. They don't grow in the way that they're supposed to grow because they don't have vitamin D. And then goiter is an iodine deficiency, and you get these big, huge, like bulges on your neck from this, called goiters. We also have scurvy, which is a vitamin C deficiency. This used to affect a lot of people that went out to sea, like pirates and stuff like that. They used to call them limeys because they would take a bunch of limes and just suck on those while they were out at sea, because that way they would not get scurvy and vitamin C deficiency, because it does all this beautiful stuff to your body. And then anemia is an iron deficiency. This happens a lot in women because when they have their periods, they bleed, and when you bleed, you're losing iron. So this happens, like I said, a lot more in women, but it can still happen in men. So looking at the opposite, obesity, where is this happening? Definitely in the United States, you know that. But then there's even parts of South America and Africa that are experiencing obesity, like South Africa, for example. So you see this a lot more in the developing world, not so much in more in the developed, not as much in the developing. And what are some factors that can lead to this? Well, there's definitely some things that we can't really control, like your genes do have a little bit to do with your weight and whether or not you're going to be obese. If it runs in your family, then you're more likely to at an older age. But you have other things that are going to be, more like choices. How much are you sitting and watching something like TV or playing on your phone or other electronics instead of doing things, exercising? What are you eating? Are you eating out every day, fast food? Or are you eating, fruits and vegetables? Are you drinking a lot of sodas that have high sugar content and other chemicals in them? So there are some things that you can control, these over here. And then there's some things like prenatal care that, we can't go back in time and do anything with that. And you can't really do anything about your genes. So it is a little bit, not your control, but most of it is our control. And then now we're seeing a ton of consequences of obesity in developed countries, and these are our drivers of sickness. So people are having a lot of not just physical, but also mental issues. We're seeing way more depression and anxiety problems and things like dementia, and these are linked to the foods that we are eating. They're also linked to other things like social media consumption, but we can definitely look and see that obesity is also increasing these things. Heart failure, asthma attacks, diabetes, cancer, all of these things are increasing dramatically. And if you are obese, you have a much higher rate of experiencing these in your lifetime. So what are some causes of hunger? We're going to go through kind of a list. So natural disasters cause hunger just because it destroys things around you, destroys cropland, and basically you just can't get food. Conflict causes hunger because if people are more, fighting each other and there's like wars going on, it's harder to grow food and it's hard to get that food to people. Poverty, we've talked a lot about. If you don't have money, then, a lot of times you just can't buy food. Poor infrastructure, if you don't have the tools necessary to produce a lot, then you don't end up producing a lot. And we also overexploit the environment. So we degrade things, we use land too much, growing one thing only and using up all the nutrients, and then the next year maybe it can't grow that anymore. And then kind of just something to think about. You don't need to write any of these down, but this is basically our spending priorities in the U.S. and the world. So what you see here is kind of like the factors like cosmetics, and then the amount of money that we spend. And these are in billions of dollars and converted to US. So the US spends 8 billion on cosmetics. In Europe, they spend 11 billion on ice cream. We have perfumes and pet foods, cigarettes in Europe, 50 billion, alcohol in Europe, 105 billion dollars. Drugs in the entire world, we spend $400 billion on. And then the military for the world is $780 billion. So that's how much money we're spending. But when you look over here on the other side of things, so with education, we're only spending $6 billion to educate people. When you look at water and sanitation, you're only spending $9, so just a little bit more than you're spending on makeup in the United States. And then looking at basic nutrition, you're spending less money on basic nutrition than people are spending on pet food in Europe and the United States. So this is just kind of put some things into perspective and to show that there is definitely room for improvement. If we kind of set our priorities a little bit differently, we can definitely feed the world. It's just a matter of whether or not we make that a priority. All right, so come in tomorrow ready to talk about this.